The morning sun painted the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey in golden hues as Catherine Middleton stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the delicate pearl earrings that had belonged to her late mother-in-law, Princess Diana. Today was not just any day. It was the day her husband would be crowned King of England, and the weight of that moment pressed upon her heart like a beautiful burden. "Your Royal Highness, it's time," whispered her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, whose own eyes glistened with unshed tears. The woman had served the royal family for over 2 decades, witnessing moments of joy and sorrow, but nothing had prepared her for the magnitude of this day. Catherine nodded, taking one last look at her reflection. The intricate coronation gown, designed by Alexander McQueen, flowed around her like liquid silver. Every stitch told a story of tradition, hope, and the future of the monarchy. The embroidered roses, thistles, shamrocks, and daffodils represented the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, each thread carefully placed by skilled artisans who had worked for months to create this masterpiece. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, Prince William stood in his ceremonial robes, staring out the window at the thousands of people already gathering along the processional route. His father, King Charles III, had passed away peacefully in his sleep just 6 months ago, leaving William to inherit not just a crown, but the dreams and expectations of an entire nation. "Papa," he whispered to the morning air, his voice barely audible, "I hope I can make you proud." His valet, James, approached quietly with the final elements of the coronation outfit, the robe of state, a magnificent crimson velvet creation trimmed with ermine that had been worn by monarchs for generations. As James carefully draped it over William's shoulders, both men felt the weight of history settling around them. "Sir, if I may," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "your father would be incredibly proud, as would your mother." William's jaw tightened at the mention of Diana. Even after all these years, the pain of losing her remained fresh, especially on days like this when her absence felt like a physical ache in his chest. He touched the sapphire ring on his finger, the same one that had once graced his mother's hand and now belonged to Catherine. Down in the Abbey's vestry, Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was making his final preparations. The elderly man had officiated countless royal ceremonies, but never a coronation. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed the ancient liturgy one more time. This was more than a religious ceremony. It was a sacred covenant between a man and his people, witnessed by God and history. The abbey itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Flowers from every corner of the Commonwealth adorned the altar and aisles. Jasmine from India, eucalyptus from Australia, maple leaves from Canada. Each bloom represented millions of people who looked to the British crown as a symbol of stability and continuity in an ever-changing world. Outside, the crowds had been gathering since before dawn. Families with children perched on their shoulders, elderly couples who remembered the last coronation, tourists who had traveled thousands of miles, all united in their desire to witness history. Street vendors sold commemorative flags and cups, while volunteers distributed water and programs to the patient masses. Among the crowd stood Margaret Thompson, an 85-year-old widow from Yorkshire. She had been just 12 years old when she watched Elizabeth II's coronation on a tiny black and white television in her family's cramped living room. Now, she clutched a faded photograph of herself from that day, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I promised myself I'd live to see another coronation," she whispered to her granddaughter, Emma, who had driven her down to London at 5 in the morning. "After all the changes, all the challenges, here we are again. The crown endures." Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand, feeling the significance of the moment, even as a skeptical millennial who had questioned the relevance of monarchy her entire life. But seeing the hope and joy in her grandmother's eyes, she began to understand that this was about more than just ceremony. It was about continuity, about the thread that connected past, present, and future. Back in the palace, Catherine's children, George, Charlotte, and Louis were being dressed in their own ceremonial outfits. 9-year-old George, heir to the throne after his father, stood solemnly as his tutor explained the significance of the day. The weight of his future destiny was still too abstract for him to fully grasp, but he understood that something important was happening. Charlotte, now 7, twirled in her miniature gown, delighting in the swish of silk against her legs. "Mama, do I look like a princess?" she asked, and Catherine's heart nearly broke at the innocence of the question. Her daughter was already a princess, but more importantly, she was still just a little girl who loved pretty dresses and spinning until she got dizzy. 5-year-old Louis was less concerned with ceremony than with the special breakfast of chocolate croissants that had been prepared for the children. He sat contentedly in his formal suit, crumbs scattered across his lap, while his nanny tried unsuccessfully to clean him up. The palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, each person aware that they were part of something extraordinary. Mrs. Henderson, the head cook who had served the royal family for 30 years, wiped away tears as she put the finishing touches on the coronation breakfast. She remembered cooking for William when he was just a boy, sneaking him extra biscuits when his mother wasn't looking. "Such a good boy he was," she murmured to her assistant chef. "Always said please and thank you, even as a little one. He'll make a fine king." In the garage, the ceremonial carriages were being given their final inspection. The Gold State coach, built in 1762, gleamed under the careful attention of the royal grooms. Its intricate carvings and gilded decorations caught the light, creating a dazzling display that would soon process through the streets of London, carrying the new king and queen. The horses, specially trained for ceremonial occasions, stood patiently in their stalls, their coats brushed to perfection, their ceremonial tack polished until it shone like mirrors. These magnificent creatures had carried royalty for generations, and they seemed to sense the importance of their role today. As the morning progressed, dignitaries from around the world began arriving at Westminster Abbey. Presidents, prime ministers, and royalty from dozens of nations came to pay their respects and witness the continuation of one of the world's oldest monarchies. Each arrival was carefully choreographed, with protocol officers ensuring that every guest was seated according to centuries-old traditions of precedence and diplomacy. In a quiet moment before the chaos of the day truly began, William walked alone through the corridors of the palace where he had grown up. He paused before a portrait of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, whose steady gaze seemed to offer both blessing and encouragement. Her reign had spanned 7 decades through world wars, social revolutions, and technological transformations that would have been unimaginable when she first took the throne. "I will try to serve as faithfully as you did, Granny," he whispered to the painted image, his voice echoing slightly in the vast hallway. The sound of church bells beginning to ring across London signaled that the moment was approaching. From Westminster Abbey to St. Paul's Cathedral, from parish churches to grand cathedrals, the bells sang out in celebration and anticipation. Their ancient voices had announced royal births, marriages, and death for centuries, and now they proclaimed the dawn of a new reign. Catherine joined her husband in the portrait gallery, and together they stood in contemplative silence. No words were necessary. Both understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. In a few hours, they would emerge from this private world into a very public destiny that would shape not only their own lives, but the lives of their children and grandchildren yet unborn. The final preparations were almost complete. Flowers had been arranged, candles lit, and the ancient regalia, the crown, scepter, and orb that symbolized royal authority, had been carefully transported from the Tower of London under heavy guard. These objects, some of them centuries old, carried the accumulated weight of British history in their precious metals and gemstones. As William prepared to leave his private apartments for the last time as a prince, he picked up a small, worn prayer book that had belonged to his mother. Diana had carried it with her during times of uncertainty and fear, and now he tucked it into his robes, knowing that she would be with him in spirit as he took the most important steps of his life. The crowds outside had grown to massive proportions, with police estimating over 1 million people lining the processional route. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, seasoned with an underlying current of emotion that touched everyone present. This was more than pageantry. It was a moment when an entire nation paused to acknowledge its history, its values, and its hopes for the future. Street musicians played traditional songs, children waved flags, and vendors called out their wares in voices hoarse from hours of use. The diversity of the crowd reflected modern Britain. Faces of every color and creed united in their desire to participate in this ancient ritual of renewal and continuity. As the ceremonial procession prepared to begin, the weight of expectation settled over everyone involved. This was not just William's coronation. It was a coronation for the people, a reaffirmation of the bonds that held the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth together through times of change and challenge. The moment had arrived. History was about to be made, one magnificent, emotional step at a time. The magnificent doors of Westminster Abbey swung open as the first notes of the coronation anthem filled the sacred space. The voices of the choir, trained for months specifically for this moment, rose in perfect harmony, their songs seeming to lift the very stones of the ancient building toward heaven. Inside the abbey, 2,000 guests rose as one, their faces turned toward the great west door where the procession would soon appear. Among the assembled congregation sat world leaders, members of parliament, representatives from the Commonwealth nations, and ordinary citizens who had been chosen to witness this historic moment. Each person felt the electricity in the air, the sense that they were participating in something that transcended politics, nationality, or personal belief. This was about the continuation of a tradition that stretched back over 1,000 years. Queen Camilla, now Queen Mother, sat in the front row, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Despite her royal composure, those who knew her well could see the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she pressed her lips together to maintain control. She was remembering her own coronation beside Charles, but also thinking of Diana, whose presence seemed to hover over this day like a gentle blessing. The processional music swelled as the first members of the royal procession entered the abbey. Clergy in their finest vestments led the way, followed by representatives of the orders of chivalry, their ceremonial swords and ancient regalia catching the light from hundreds of candles. Each step was measured, rehearsed to perfection, yet somehow the solemnity of the moment made every movement feel fresh and profound. Prince Harry entered with the other members of the royal family, his face a mask of composed emotion. The years of estrangement from his brother had been difficult for both men, but today was bigger than their personal struggles. Harry's eyes searched the abbey until they found William, and, for just a moment, the two brothers exchanged a look that spoke of shared memories, shared loss, and perhaps the possibility of healing. The congregation held its collective breath as the regalia proceeded down the aisle. St. Edward's crown, which would soon rest upon William's head, was carried on a velvet cushion by the Dean of Westminster. The crown, made of solid gold and encrusted with semi-precious stones, had crowned English monarchs for centuries. Its weight, nearly 5 pounds, was nothing compared to the responsibility it represented. Behind the crown came the other symbols of royal authority: the sovereign's scepter with cross, containing the largest cut diamond in the world, the sovereign's orb representing Christ's dominion over the world, and the coronation ring, known as the wedding ring of England, which would bind William to his people in sacred covenant. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The doors opened wider, and Catherine appeared, radiant in her coronation gown. The congregation gasped audibly at the sight of her. The McQueen creation was more than clothing. It was a work of art that somehow managed to honor tradition while embracing modernity. The bodice was fitted perfectly to her frame, while the skirt flowed behind her in a train that seemed to capture and reflect every ray of light in the abbey. But it was not just the dress that took people's breath away. Catherine herself seemed transformed, elevated somehow by the magnitude of the moment. She moved with a grace that spoke of years of preparation, but also with a humanity that made her accessible to everyone watching. Her smile was gentle but confident, acknowledging the overwhelming nature of the day while embracing her destiny. Behind Catherine walked her children, each one playing their part in this grand pageant. George, as heir apparent, carried himself with a dignity that belied his young years. He had been practicing his role for weeks, and now he walked with measured steps, his young face serious but not frightened. Charlotte followed, her natural confidence shining through as she waved discreetly to the crowd, bringing smiles to faces throughout the abbey. Little Louis, despite his best efforts to be solemn, couldn't help but grin at the spectacle around him. The sight of the royal children moved many in the congregation to tears. These were not just symbols of the monarchy's future. They were real children with scraped knees and lost teeth and favorite bedtime stories. Their presence reminded everyone that beneath all the ceremony and tradition, this was ultimately about family, about the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. Finally, William appeared at the great doors, and the entire abbey seemed to exhale at once. He wore the robe of state over his military uniform, the crimson velvet and ermine creating a striking contrast against the ancient stones of the abbey. But it was his face that captured attention, composed yet emotional, ready yet humble. Here was a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life, yet who clearly understood the weight of what he was about to undertake. As William walked down the aisle, his eyes swept over the congregation, taking in the faces of friends, family, and dignitaries who had come to witness his coronation. He saw his old school friends, military colleagues, charity workers he had met during his years of public service. Each face represented a different part of his life, a different aspect of his preparation for this role. The music reached a crescendo as the royal family took their places before the high altar. The abbey fell silent except for the sound of rustling silk and the distant murmur of crowds outside. Through the massive windows, filtered sunlight created patterns of colored light on the ancient floor, as if heaven itself were blessing this ceremony. Archbishop Welby stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space as he began the recognition ceremony. "Sirs, I here present unto you King William, your undoubted king. Wherefore all you who are come this day to do your homage and service, are you willing to do the same?" The congregation's response, "God save King William," thundered through the abbey with such force that it seemed to shake the very foundations. The recognition was more than mere ceremony. It was the moment when the people officially accepted William as their sovereign. The sound of 2,000 voices raised in unison was overwhelming, carrying with it centuries of tradition and the hopes of millions who watched around the world. Catherine watched her husband during this moment, her heart swelling with pride and love. She could see the emotion in his eyes, carefully controlled but deeply felt. This was the man she had fallen in love with at university, the father of her children, but now he was becoming something more, a symbol, a servant to his people, a keeper of traditions that stretched back through the mists of time. The coronation oath came next, each word carefully pronounced as William promised to govern according to law, to execute justice with mercy, and to maintain the Church of England. His voice was steady and clear, carrying across the abbey and through television broadcasts to billions of viewers worldwide. But those closest to him could hear the slight catch in his throat, the emotion that he worked so hard to contain. When he promised to maintain the Protestant Reformed religion established by law, the weight of religious history settled over the ceremony. This was not just a political investiture. It was a sacred covenant, blessed by God and witnessed by the Church. The Archbishop's hands trembled slightly as he anointed William with holy oil, using the same spoon that had been used for English coronations for 800 years. The anointing was done in private, screened from the view of the congregation, and cameras by a canopy held by 4 peers of the realm. In that moment of privacy and sanctity, William felt the full weight of divine blessing settling upon him. The holy oil, cool against his forehead, seemed to seal his transformation from prince to king. As the canopy was removed, revealing William in his simple white tunic, the congregation could see that something fundamental had changed. The informality of his youth was gone, replaced by a majesty that seemed to emanate from within. This was no longer Prince William. This was King William IV, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of his other realms and territories king, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. The investiture with regalia followed, each item handed to the new king with words that had been spoken at coronations for centuries. The spurs were touched to his heels, symbolizing chivalry and honor. The sword was girded at his side, representing his duty to protect his people. The armills were placed on his wrists, ancient symbols of sincerity and wisdom. When the sovereign's orb was placed in William's left hand, many in the congregation thought of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had held the same orb at her coronation 70 years earlier. The continuity was profound and moving, a reminder that the monarchy was bigger than any individual, an institution that had survived wars, revolutions, and the changing tides of history. The sovereign's ring came next, slipped onto the 4th finger of William's right hand by the archbishop. "Receive the ring of kingly dignity," the archbishop intoned, "and the seal of Catholic faith, and as you are this day consecrated to be our head and prince, so may you continue steadfastly as the defender of Christ's religion." Finally came the scepter, symbol of royal power and justice. As William's fingers closed around the ancient rod, topped with a cross and containing the Star of Africa diamond, he felt the full weight of authority settling into his grasp. This was not power for its own sake, but power in service, the authority to govern, to protect, to serve his people with wisdom and compassion. The moment everyone had been waiting for was at hand. St. Edward's crown was lifted high above William's head, its gold and jewels catching the light streaming through the abbey's ancient windows. Time seemed suspended as the archbishop spoke the words of coronation. "Be thy head anointed with holy oil," as kings, priests, and prophets were anointed, and as Solomon was anointed king by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, so be thou anointed, blessed, and consecrated king over the peoples, whom the Lord thy God hath given thee to rule and govern. As the crown descended onto William's head, the abbey erupted in celebration. "God save the king!" rang out from 2,000 voices, while the guns of the Tower of London began their royal salute. Church bells across London and throughout the Commonwealth began to peal, their bronze voices carrying the news of the new reign to every corner of the realm. Catherine felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her husband transformed before her eyes. The weight of the crown seemed to change his very posture, endowing him with a dignity and presence that spoke of divine appointment. He was still the man she loved, but he was also now something more, the embodiment of 1,000 years of history, the keeper of traditions that would pass to their children and their children's children. Outside the abbey, the crowds erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing off the ancient buildings of Westminster. Flags waved, strangers embraced, and children who had waited for hours in the cold suddenly forgot their discomfort in the joy of the moment. This was their king, chosen by birth but confirmed by ceremony, blessed by God, and accepted by the people. The newly crowned King William IV sat in St. Edward's chair, the ancient coronation throne that had witnessed the crowning of English monarchs for over 7 centuries. The Stone of Destiny, returned from Scotland for this sacred ceremony, rested beneath the seat where his feet touched the ground. In this moment, he felt connected not just to his immediate predecessors, but to every king and queen who had sat in this chair, who had felt the weight of the crown and the burden of responsibility that came with it. The homage ceremony began with his son, Prince George, who at 9 years old was now officially the Prince of Wales and heir apparent to the throne. The young boy approached his father with steps that had been carefully rehearsed, but his natural dignity shone through the formal movements. Kneeling before the throne, George spoke the ancient words of homage in his clear, young voice. I, George Philip Arthur Lewis, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die against all manner of folk. William's heart nearly broke as he listened to his son's words. Here was his child, barely old enough to truly understand the weight of what he was saying, yet speaking words that bound him to a destiny neither of them had chosen, but both were born to fulfill. When George rose and kissed his father's cheek, William whispered so quietly that only his son could hear, I love you, my boy. Always remember that before anything else. The senior members of the royal family followed, each offering their homage to the new king. Prince Harry's approach was watched with particular interest by the congregation and the millions watching worldwide. The brothers had endured years of public scrutiny about their relationship, but in this moment, protocol and family duty transcended personal differences. I, Henry Charles Albert David, Duke of Sussex, Harry began, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die against all manner of folk. When he rose and embraced his brother, both men's eyes glistened with unshed tears. In that moment, they were not just king and subject, but brothers who had weathered the storms of life together, who had lost their mother too young, who had found their way to manhood despite impossible circumstances. The congregation watched this exchange with rapt attention, understanding that they were witnessing not just a formal ceremony, but a moment of genuine human connection. The monarchy, for all its pomp and circumstance, was ultimately about family, about the bonds that hold people together through triumph and tragedy, love and loss. Following the royal family, the Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior clergy offered their homage, representing the Church of England's acceptance of William's role as supreme governor. The ancient words took on new meaning as they were spoken in voices that trembled with emotion, reminding everyone present that this was not merely a political ceremony, but a sacred covenant between monarch and people blessed by divine authority. Then came the moment for Catherine's coronation as queen consort. She approached the altar with the same grace she had shown throughout the ceremony, her coronation gown rustling softly against the ancient stones. The queen consort's crown, a masterpiece of diamonds and precious stones created specifically for this occasion, waited on the altar beside the other regalia. As Catherine knelt before the archbishop, her children watched from their seats with wide eyes. Charlotte leaned forward, mesmerized by her mother's transformation from the woman who helped with homework and kissed scraped knees into this figure of majesty and grace. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to understand that something monumentally important was happening to his mother. Will you solemnly promise and swear to serve the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the other realms and territories according to their respective laws and customs? The archbishop asked. Catherine's response was clear and strong. I solemnly promise so to do. The anointing of the queen consort was a moment of profound spirituality. As the holy oil touched Catherine's forehead, she felt a transformation taking place within her soul. She was no longer simply Catherine Middleton, or even the Duchess of Cambridge. She was Queen Catherine, called to serve alongside her husband in one of the world's most demanding roles. The queen consort's crown was lifted high, its diamonds catching the light streaming through the abbey's stained glass windows. As it descended onto Catherine's head, the congregation held its breath. When the crown settled onto her brow, spontaneous applause broke out throughout the abbey, a breach of protocol that spoke to the genuine affection the people felt for their new queen. William watched his wife's coronation with tears streaming freely down his face, no longer concerned with maintaining royal composure. This was the woman who had stood by him through years of public scrutiny, who had brought joy and stability to his life, who had given him 3 beautiful children and had prepared herself with grace and determination for this moment. Seeing her crowned as his queen felt like the completion of a journey they had begun together as university students, never imagining it would lead to this ancient abbey and this sacred ceremony. The service continued with the celebration of Holy Communion, a reminder that the coronation was fundamentally a religious ceremony. As William and Catherine received the bread and wine, they were participating in a ritual that connected them not only to centuries of English monarchs, but to Christians around the world. The sacraments served as a reminder that earthly power was temporary, but their commitment to service was eternal. The final blessing was pronounced by Archbishop Welby, his voice carrying across the abbey with words that had been spoken at coronations for centuries. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. As the words echoed through the ancient building, many in the congregation felt they were witnessing something transcendent, a moment when heaven touched earth. The Te Deum was sung with such power and beauty that it seemed to lift the very roof of the abbey. The choir's voices soared in praise, joined by the congregation and carried beyond the abbey walls by the television and radio broadcast that brought the ceremony to billions of people worldwide. In homes across the Commonwealth, families gathered around their televisions felt connected to this ancient ritual of renewal and hope. As the service concluded, the newly crowned King William IV and Queen Catherine prepared to leave Westminster Abbey and begin their procession back to Buckingham Palace. The transformation was complete. They entered the abbey as prince and princess, but they would leave as king and queen, forever changed by the sacred ceremony they had just experienced. The procession out of the abbey was magnificent beyond description. William wore St. Edward's crown and the purple robe of his state, while Catherine wore her queen consort's crown and a robe of purple velvet trimmed with ermine. Their children followed, each one aware that their lives had been fundamentally altered by what they had just witnessed. As the royal family emerged from the abbey into the London sunshine, the crowd's roar was deafening. Millions of people lined the streets, waving flags, cheering, and crying with joy. The gold state coach waited to carry the new monarchs back to the palace, its ornate decorations gleaming in the afternoon light. The sight of William and Catherine in their coronation regalia climbing into the historic coach was almost overwhelmingly beautiful. Here was the continuity of tradition embodied in living form. A young king and queen beginning their reign with the full pomp and ceremony of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. The procession route was lined with members of the armed forces in their dress uniforms, their precision and bearing adding to the majesty of the moment. The household cavalry led the way, their horses prancing proudly as they escorted their sovereign through the streets of his capital city. Inside the coach, William and Catherine sat in awed silence for the first few moments, overwhelmed by what they had just experienced and what lay ahead. The weight of their crowns was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility they now carried. But they faced it together, as they had faced every challenge since their marriage. "Are you ready for this?" William asked his wife, reaching for her hand. "With you beside me, I'm ready for anything," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. As the coach rolled through the streets of London, the crowds pressed forward for a glimpse of their new king and queen. Children waved from their parents' shoulders, elderly people wept with emotion, and teenagers who had grown up knowing only Queen Elizabeth II as monarch saw for the first time what the future of their country looked like. The international dignitaries who had witnessed the coronation began their own journeys back to their respective countries, carrying with them stories of a ceremony that had exceeded all expectations. The coronation had been more than a ritual. It had been a demonstration of British tradition, values, and unity that resonated far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. Television commentators struggled to find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. The ceremony had been flawless in its execution, but more than that, it had been deeply moving in its humanity. The sight of William's tears when Catherine was crowned, the dignity of the royal children, the genuine emotion of the congregation, all of these elements had combined to create something truly special. Social media exploded with images and reactions from around the world. Hashtag King William and hashtag Queen Catherine trended globally as people shared their thoughts and feelings about the historic ceremony. The images of the royal family in their coronation regalia would become iconic, joining the pantheon of great royal photographs that captured moments of national significance. In hospital wards and nursing homes across the Commonwealth, patients and residents had gathered around television screens to watch the ceremony. For many elderly viewers, this was their second or even third coronation, and they marveled at how the ancient ceremony had adapted to modern times while maintaining its essential dignity and meaning. The procession reached Buckingham Palace as the afternoon sun began to lower in the sky. The royal standard flew proudly from the flagpole, announcing to all of London that the sovereign was in residence. The crowds in front of the palace had been waiting for hours to catch a glimpse of the newly crowned monarchs, and their patience was about to be rewarded. As William and Catherine disappeared into the palace, the reality of their transformation began to settle over the watching world. The carefree prince and his bride were gone, replaced by a king and queen whose lives would now be dedicated entirely to service. It was both an ending and a beginning, the close of one chapter in British royal history and the opening of another that would shape the monarchy for generations to come. The balcony of Buckingham Palace had witnessed countless historic moments, but few as emotionally charged as this one. Behind the familiar red curtains, King William IV and Queen Catherine prepared for their first public appearance as crowned monarchs. The weight of St. Edward's crown had been replaced by the lighter imperial state crown, but the weight of responsibility remained unchanged. Palace staff members who had served the royal family for decades found themselves overcome with emotion as they made final adjustments to the royal regalia. Mrs. Angela Kelly, who had served as dresser to Queen Elizabeth II for many years, now tended to Catherine with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice thick with decades of devotion, "you look absolutely radiant." The late queen would be so proud. The title fell naturally from her lips, though just hours earlier Catherine had been Your Royal Highness. The transformation was complete, sacred, and irreversible. William stood at the window, looking out at the sea of faces below. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, thousands upon thousands of people who had waited patiently for this moment. Union Jack flags fluttered like colorful butterflies above the masses, while smartphones held high captured every possible angle of the palace facade. Prince George approached his father, still wearing his ceremonial outfit, but with his tie slightly loosened. "Papa, are you nervous?" the 9-year-old asked with a directness that only children possess. William knelt down to his son's level, placing gentle hands on the boy's shoulders. "A little," he admitted honestly, "but that's okay. Being nervous means we care about doing our best for all those people who believe in us." Charlotte and Louis joined them at the window, their young faces pressed against the glass as they marveled at the enormous crowd below. Charlotte, ever the social one, waved enthusiastically even though the people couldn't see her yet. Louis simply stared in wonder, his 5-year-old mind trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. "Will all those people always be watching us now?" Charlotte asked, her natural intuition grasping something profound about their new reality. Catherine joined the family group, her coronation gown replaced with a slightly simpler but equally stunning outfit designed for the balcony appearance. "They'll be watching because they care about us, darling," she explained to her daughter. and we'll spend our lives showing them how much we care about them, too. The moment arrived. Palace doors opened, and the royal family stepped onto the balcony to face their people. The roar that erupted from the crowd was unlike anything London had ever heard. It wasn't just cheering. It was the voice of a nation expressing joy, hope, relief, and love all at once. The sound echoed off the buildings surrounding the palace, creating a wall of noise that seemed to embrace the royal family. William and Catherine stood at the front of the balcony, their children beside them, waving to the massive crowd below. The sight of the new king in his crown and ceremonial robes, standing beside his beautiful queen and their 3 children, created an image that would be remembered for generations. Professional photographers and amateur smartphone users alike capture the moment, but no image could truly convey the electricity in the air, the sense that history was being made in real time. In the crowd below, Margaret Thompson, the elderly woman who had traveled from Yorkshire, finally let her emotions overflow completely. Tears streamed down her face as she waved her small flag, thinking of all the changes she had witnessed in her long life. Her granddaughter Emma stood beside her, no longer skeptical about the monarchy's relevance, but genuinely moved by the obvious love between the royal family and their people. "Look at them," Margaret whispered to Emma, her voice barely audible above the crowd's roar. "They're so young, but they understand. They know what this means." Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand, finally understanding what the old woman had tried to explain to her. This wasn't about privilege or ceremony, but about service and sacrifice. The flypast by the Royal Air Force was perfectly timed, with the red arrows trailing red, white, and blue smoke across the London sky, just as the crowd's cheers reached their peak. The sight of the aircraft formation above the palace, with the new king and queen watching from the balcony below, created a moment of such patriotic beauty that even the most cynical observers found themselves moved. William pointed out the aircraft to his children, explaining the significance of each squadron that passed overhead. George listened intently, his young mind already absorbing the military heritage that would one day be part of his own responsibilities. Charlotte clapped excitedly at the colorful smoke trails, while Louis tried to count the planes before they disappeared into the distance. The family remained on the balcony for nearly 20 minutes, waving, pointing out members of the crowd to each other, and simply sharing this extraordinary moment with their people. When young Louis began to tire and lean against his mother, Catherine smoothly scooped him up, creating an image of maternal warmth that melted hearts around the world. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, the royal family waved their final farewell and retreated into the palace. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, as if leaving would somehow diminish the magic of what they had experienced. Inside the palace, the royal family gathered in the private apartments for their first meal as the new monarchy. The children were allowed to stay up past their usual bedtime, understanding instinctively that this was a special day that required special treatment. The coronation crown jewels were carefully removed and returned to their secure keeping, but the weight of responsibility remained. William sat in an armchair that had belonged to his father, still wearing his ceremonial uniform, but with his medals and orders finally removed. Catherine curled up on the sofa beside him, her shoes kicked off, and her feet tucked under her like any tired wife at the end of a long day. "How do you feel?" she asked her husband, studying his face for signs of the emotion she knew he was processing. "Different," William replied after a long pause. "The same, but completely different. Does that make sense?" Catherine nodded, understanding perfectly. They were still the same people who had fallen in love at university, who worried about their children's scraped knees and school performances, who enjoyed quiet evenings watching television together. But they were also now king and queen, their lives no longer entirely their own, their every decision carrying weight far beyond their personal preferences. The children had been put to bed by their nanny, but not before each had been allowed to hold one of the ceremonial objects from the coronation. George had been fascinated by the weight and craftsmanship of the scepter, while Charlotte had been mesmerized by the sparkle of the queen consort's crown. Louis had been most interested in the ceremonial sword, though he wasn't allowed to touch it. As the evening progressed, William and Catherine received congratulations from world leaders, family members who hadn't attended the ceremony, and close personal friends. Each phone call brought the reality of their new situation into sharper focus. They were no longer William and Catherine. They were their majesties, representatives not just of themselves, but of an entire institution, an entire people. Prince Harry stopped by the private apartments before leaving for his hotel, the brothers sharing a quiet moment away from the public eye. The ceremony had stirred up memories of their mother, of their grandmother, of all the family members who were no longer there to see this day. But it had also reminded them of the bonds that survived death, distance, and disagreement. She would have been so proud, Harry said simply, and William knew he meant both their mother and their grandmother. "I know," William replied. "I felt her with me today, with all of us." The brothers embraced again, this time without the formality of the ceremony, just two men who had shared loss and were now sharing the complex emotions of this triumphant day. As midnight approached, William and Catherine finally found themselves alone together for the first time since the early morning. The palace had grown quiet, with only the security staff and night duty personnel maintaining their silent vigil. They walked together through the corridors they now ruled, past portraits of monarchs who had faced their own challenges, their own moments of triumph and crisis. Each painting seemed to offer silent counsel, reminding the new king and queen that they were part of something larger than themselves, inheritors of a legacy that stretched back through centuries. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked as they paused before a portrait of Queen Victoria. "About time," William replied thoughtfully. "How fast it goes, but also how it connects us to everyone who came before and everyone who'll come after. Today felt eternal while it was happening, but it's already becoming a memory." They reached their private sitting room, where a fire had been lit in the grate and tea prepared on a small table. The intimate setting provided a stark contrast to the grandeur of the day's events, reminding them that despite all the ceremony and spectacle, they were still fundamentally a family seeking comfort and connection with each other. William removed his ceremonial uniform for the final time, hanging it carefully in the wardrobe, where it would remain as a tangible reminder of this extraordinary day. Catherine changed into comfortable clothing, her movements still slightly stiff from hours of maintaining perfect posture in heavy ceremonial dress. They sat together by the fire, sharing tea and quiet conversation about the day's events. The enormity of what had happened was beginning to sink in, but so was the sense of rightness, of destiny fulfilled. They had prepared for this moment their entire adult lives, but no amount of preparation could truly ready someone for the reality of becoming monarch. "I love you," Catherine said simply, the words carrying extra weight in the context of their new roles. Love would be their anchor in the storms ahead, their source of strength when the burdens of kingship felt overwhelming. "I love you too," William replied, reaching for her hand. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside their window, London slept peacefully under the protection of their new king and queen. The coronation was over, but the reign had only just begun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, in the quiet of their private rooms, William and Catherine simply held each other and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The coronation outfit that had moved millions lay carefully preserved, ready to take its place in history alongside the regalia of monarchs who had ruled before. But the real transformation had nothing to do with clothing or crowns. It was the change in two hearts that had accepted the sacred duty of service, ready to spend their lives in dedication to their people. The sight that had moved millions was not just the stunning visual of ceremony and tradition, but the deeper truth it represented, that love, duty, and sacrifice could still inspire in a modern world, that ancient rituals could still touch contemporary hearts, and that the future of the monarchy rested in worthy hands. As the fire burned low in the grate and the palace settled into sleep, King William IV and Queen Catherine began the first night of their reign, ready to write the next chapter in a story that had been unfolding for over 1,000 years.